know what? How are you? Well, maybe I'll pause it for a second so I can do the how do you do's. Okay, so um, I've called this PowerPoint "Open the Freezer" because to me that's the main takeaway that I want you guys to get from this. But what it's essentially going back to is something that we covered in one of the Coursera lessons, and I know questions about this were on the midterm exam, which is the difference between direct and indirect evidence, and what that has to do with this concept of opening the freezer in reporting. So basically, verification is a process that establishes or confirms the accuracy or truth of something. News organizations hire editors and researchers to check information and assure reports are factual and fair. So in other words, just to make sure that something is real and it's there, okay? And, you know, uh, so one of the questions, one of the ways to test this is this idea of like opening the freezer. So I might as well let's explain. There's a slide about this at the end, and you know what? Let me jump to the slide about it just so that we're looking at something while I explain opening the freezer. Which is so what it says here on the slide that just kind of encapsulates the story is if there's one cautionary tale about the difference between direct and indirect evidence that every news literacy student leaves this course remembering, it is the case of Brian Thevenot's coverage of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina a decade ago in New Orleans. So what happened was that these National Guard troops were at the Superdome in New Orleans, and they told the reporter that there was a freezer in the Dome Stadium where there were something like supposedly a dozen corpses. They just said that there was this freezer that was full of corpses. Now, when the National Guard troops, it was like a couple of troops that told the reporter this. I think the freezer was like right behind the soldiers that told this to the troops, and they pointed at the freezer behind them and they said, yeah, this thing is full of corpses. The reporter did not walk around the soldiers and actually opened the freezer and look for himself to see whether in fact there were corpses in the freezer. He just took their word for it, and as it turned out, I'm not sure it was a nefarious mistake. I think what happened was these soldiers had actually been told by somebody else. It was kind of like one of these rumors that had circulated that, there's all these bodies in this freezer, and just nobody actually opened the freezer to find out. And so when it came out that the story was completely inaccurate and that there hadn't been all these deaths, and that the reporting about the deaths or the carnage at the Cajun zone, not the Cajun Dome, sorry, the Superdome was completely overblown. As everybody did kind of a post-mortem and said, like, well, what went wrong here? That's where this phrase came out. Did the reporter open the freezer? Like, did the reporter actually go and check for themselves and lay eyes on the proof to make sure that what they were getting was accurate? Okay. And then that ends up serving as a metaphor or analogy for us about being able to verify whether something's true or not. So that's kind of like the whole preface of this whole talk, right? And so what they say is, let's go back to slide one. What's the evidence? Did the reporter open the freezer? Are the facts then put in context? So, sometimes you can have information that's true, but if you don't show that information relative to anything else, that can lead to such a distortion that it's essentially a lie in itself, right? And I'm trying to think of a good example of that off the top of my head, but I think you guys are familiar with what I'm talking about. And then finally, is the report transparent? Let me reduce this for a second so I can see your faces. And just to ask, wait, hold on. Are we resuming? Okay. When they say, is the report transparent? What does transparency mean to you guys in journalism?
I mean, like the main thing that comes to mind initially is just, is there something that you're very obviously hiding? Like if for me, it feels a little like the context point, like put the facts in context and make sure that there's not something major that you're missing. Like just be, is there obviously something that you're hiding that could change the context or the meaning of the story?
Right. So here's one of the most specific ways that when, at least as a teaching tool and trying to teach you guys their very specific approach to news literacy that Stony Brook University does, the way they bring up transparency is obviously if I have an anonymous source in a story, I'm not being transparent, right? But actually, when they bring up transparency, they're specifically in most cases talking about a situation with an anonymous source. So if you were using an anonymous source, how would the concept of transparency in an article come into play? Do you guys understand what I'm saying? How is transparency something that could still be an issue if, okay, I'm going to use anonymous sources in my stuff? Is there a way to be transparent about that?
If the anonymous source is in danger or something like that, or if they
Right.
have like a conflicting.
So how could the reporter
Yeah.
be transparent about that?
Maybe stating why they're leaving their sources anonymous, like the specific reason that they could be in danger, something like
Exactly.
that.
It was kind of a funky question and a tough question, but do you guys get what she's saying? So in a lot of these sort of Stony Brook exercises, they'll give you an article. There will be some sources who are maybe anonymous or who aren't, fully identified. And what the question will be, say on our final exam or on one of the workbook exercises was, how would you evaluate the transparency of this report? And then what you would look at is to what extent, okay, they've used an anonymous source, but to what extent have they explained why the source is anonymous, right? Or have they given us what information they can so that we understand, what's going on here? It's not just all kind of behind a veil. So there's that question of, is a source transparent, right? I'm gonna blow this back up again. Whoops. So this then gets to the issue of since we're talking about proof of direct and indirect evidence, okay? So what do we mean by direct evidence? The strongest and most reliable evidence is the direct kind. Eyewitness testimony, physical evidence like a fingerprint or DNA report, a photo, audio, or video that establishes a fact. So speaking of sensationalism, I guess the folks at Stony Brook are into that because for the first example, they give us audio, fasten your seatbelts, I guess, because this is a little bit intense. It's from the incident that happened in Beirut just a few months ago.
تعطينا لمحة عن
So, okay, and actually there was a question about that, right? Which was really, do you guys remember what question came up about, in fact, the evidence of it with the bombing? So Trump had said, "Oh, somebody set off a bomb," and it turned out that it wasn't somebody setting off a bomb. It was these explosive chemicals that had been in a warehouse for who knows how long. And it did cause an enormous political upheaval, though, because this was such evidence of such terrible negligence on the part of the government. Do any of you guys remember this incident? So yeah, that happened. It was a horrific explosion, and it brought down the government in Beirut. I really haven't, we've been so caught up in our own crazy politics that I haven't seen much coverage of what's going on in Lebanon now. But I mean, it brought the government down. There were huge demonstrations in the streets, and the government fell. Everybody had to step down. So I mean, in some ways, those videos don't even capture it. If you go online and you look at the size of the explosion, I mean, it's just unbelievable. So obviously, I mean, what was their point of why did Stony Brook throw that video on there? What was their point in showing the video?
Like of like direct evidence or like what were you saying? Like direct.
Yeah, I mean, you see why they bothered to show all of that. In other words, we see all of that. That wasn't faked, right? I mean, I suppose on some, as things get crazier and crazier in our society, right? We have to begin to wonder. It seems like it's going to keep raising the bar by what is going to convince us of like what we see online is real. But I think Stony Brook was trying to show us an example of something where we see the video and we go, okay, because of that video, we know that was real. Does it, I mean, what do any of you guys have any thoughts about that? Because it wouldn't be hard to do in this day and age to fake that, right? Even so, right? So I think it does on a certain level, some of this stuff, if you want to get more philosophical about it, you say, well, yeah, but how much is that really evidence? Is anything really evidence in 2020? Do you guys have any opinion about that to share while I'm loading up this example of audio evidence? So, okay, let's listen to this. So this is their example of sound evidence. And it says, weeks before virus panic, intelligence chairman privately raised alarm, sold stocks.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Fidelity Wealth Management. At Fidelity, you'll have access to personalized advice for market movement and flexible strategies for changing priorities. Learn more at fidelity.com/wealth. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC.
NPR has obtained a secret recording taken 3 weeks ago. You're going to hear the voice of Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Richard Burr, Republican in the Senate. You're going to hear him warning a private audience about how the coronavirus would impact the United States.
There's one thing that I can tell you about this. It is much more aggressive in its transmission than anything that we have seen in recent history. It's probably more akin to the 1918 pandemic.
More akin to the 1918 pandemic is what you heard him say there. This was a stronger message than most Americans were hearing at that time. And Burr's comments raised questions about why an audience at a lunch on Capitol Hill would get what seemed to be a more frank assessment than the general public. NPR's Tim Mack is the one who got his hands on this recording and is with us this morning. Hi, Tim.
Hey there.
Okay, so who was the senator speaking to in this clip, and where'd the tape come from?
Well, the luncheon was organized by the Tar Heel Circle, which consists of businesses and organizations from North Carolina, the state that Senator Burr represents. Membership in the Tar Heel Circle costs between $500 and $10,000. Burr was talking candidly about his assessment about how bad the coronavirus might become in the US. And the tape comes from an attendee who became alarmed about Burr's dire warnings, so began to record.
Oh, so worried and saying this sounds like very serious stuff. I better start recording this. What else did the senator say?
Okay, so that's an example of audio evidence. Did what we just heard right there raise another issue that we've just been talking about? Transparency, right? So, you know, where
Like it's transparency, but also I feel like audio is less reliable because like the first thing I thought of when you said audio after we watched the video was like, for example, tape recordings aren't admissible evidence in a court of law because there's the fear or the possibility that they could be faked. So unless like there's an audio match to someone's voice, I feel like there's a lot more chances for it to be faked.
you know, I think that like I'm teaching a class with like a rabbit hole in it, or like a through the looking glass, where like almost at the end of every sentence and at everything we say about the concept that anything is verifiable, or there's you know, are we chasing like the rabbit that goes around the track or whatever when we talk about news literacy? What do you guys think?
Well, that was your point, right? Wasn't your point that like we should be critical about verification for media like audio and video?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm contradicting myself then, because, you know, how can we present direct and indirect evidence if we can't agree that anything like evidence even exists, right? But then now we're straight on the road to QAnon, right? Aren't we? I mean, isn't there a direct relationship between? I mean, I heard, you know, at least, I mean, Bill Maher said it. If you want to, I'm sure he was quoting something. Oh, he didn't give the source, but he said 25% of the country now believes in QAnon, in the QAnon conspiracy. Do any of you guys find that possible to believe?
Yes.
So, and of course, that's the conspiracy theory that there is an international conspiracy of Democrats and Hollywood celebrities that worship Satan and traffic in children and drink their blood. And something like 25% of the country believes that. Now, but you can see how there's a logical road, right? Of like, if all of us who maybe don't believe in Satan worshiping Democrats drinking the blood of children all agree right here and now, that I don't know that any of this really at the end of the day qualifies as evidence, because video can be faked, audio can be faked. You know, what about the next here? The next thing on the list of examples. So not to give Noah PTSD, but photos. Right? So, you know, they conclude this by saying the strongest and most reliable evidence is direct evidence, eyewitness testimony, physical evidence like a fingerprint or DNA, a document, photo, or recording. So what do you guys think? I mean, anyone have any, I mean, I don't know that I do, but anyone have any follow-up thoughts to what we're saying about, well, okay, if you say so, Dr. G, if your PowerPoints that you brought in say so, I guess, but to Noah's point, I mean, you know, you asked a good question to which I don't really have an answer, right, Noah? You know, is any of this evidence?
Oh, I was just kind of going down the route that I thought you were paving for us.
I
Because
wish.
there
I wish,
is,
you know.
and then there was also that White House footage that got doctored to make it look like someone was attacking or a reporter was attacking somebody or something. Like they sped up the motion of someone fighting over a mic to make it look like someone assaulted the other. And it's just, there are flukes and there is fake testimony, but I guess you just kind of have to trust, like, it's like Stephen Glass. He fabricated all his stuff, which was most notable because of how like outlandish and rare of an occurrence that was. For the most part, while a lot of it is unverifiable, we take a lot of faith. We put a lot of faith in newspapers. They put faith in us for trusting them, and you know, it's just kind of suspending your belief for the greater good on both sides.
Yeah, but it's not supposed to be, right? There's
Well, it kind of has to be, since when people are aware that things can be doctored, they don't want to imagine that that's a common occurrence. They just kind of go, okay, I'm going to trust that you're being honest here, and largely that is upheld, I'd say.
Yeah.
Even though the possibility is there, we just kind of have to believe in it, because what else are we going to do?
What about have you guys have heard the term deep fakes? You guys have not heard about this?
It sounds kind of familiar.
So
Yeah, I've heard of it.
maybe I'll share a reading about it, or some readings about it. But essentially, it's that they're able to like take a video of anybody. Okay, like they'll be able to take a video of Barack Obama and get his voice sounding right and get him saying like whatever they want him saying. You know, so you could have anybody and it looks like a real video of the person, but you can just have them saying whatever it is you want them to be saying. Can you guys imagine how much more complicated things might become with that out there?
I mean, I think it could be complicated, but I also think you would have to rely on the people's intelligence. Like, because obviously, like, if it's going to be a deep fake, then, like, obviously there's going to be, like, some sign that is a deep fake. Like, I don't know, maybe it glitches out or, like, the audio gets weird for, like, 0.5 seconds. Like, those who are, like, able to notice it will probably be able to call it out more easier, but I think it just relies on people's intelligence.
But I guess the deeper question is, are we in a static situation with all of this stuff, or is it changing? You know, like when you say Noah and when you say Luna, well, like people are just going to need to exercise their common sense, God damn it. And we suspend our disbelief a little bit to believe the newspaper. Are we going to be as safe? Is it going to be as easy to know truth from fiction and what's going on 5 years from now or 2 years from now? I mean, are we on a road? Are we heading in a certain direction? Are you guys concerned about that?
Well, I mean, I think this is just kind of an example of technology being used for the wrong purposes, but I do think along the way, like, we're going to get to a point where we're going to have more, like, elevated, like, technological, like, advances. But I think for right now, this is just an example of technology being used in the wrong way for malpurpose.
You know, it occurs to me that like if we aren't able to deal with this pandemic and people are trapped in their Zoom sessions and then these virtual interactions and stuff, does that start to make it worse and worse? Like the longer this pandemic goes on, the more that our reality becomes virtual, the more the line between, you know, what's true and what's invented or concocted gets blurry, right?
Nah,
No.
I just think, I mean, we're functionally the same people that went into the pandemic as we will be coming out. The technology we have is the technology we had at the start of it. And like, maybe people will begin using functions we already had more often, but I think a lot of people at the same time are more eager to get back to the traditional way we did things.
Well, I
Like,
hope
Yeah,
in a
we're
vaccine.
smarter than that.
yeah, we're old fashioned to a degree.
I think you guys are pretty confident we'll have a vaccine and this is going to be over. Like,
You posed the hypothetical.
Yeah,
I'm not concerned about it. I agree with you guys. But I also think that like we're counting on science to like all of a sudden solve this pandemic. And at the same time, I think we're becoming an increasingly anti-science society. And this is probably, I mean, like one of the clips I used in 200 was to quote Bill Maher again, he was doing a interview with Fareed Zakaria, and Fareed Zakaria just came out with a book saying this pandemic should be a wake-up call that we're sort of like driving a race car without a safety belt. That our whole global sort of 21st century rate of consumption, rate of encroaching into areas of wilderness, all the rest of it is we're going full speed ahead and we don't know where we're going. And that if the scientists are saying another pandemic is inevitable, and Bill Maher responded by saying, yeah, I don't think we just learned from this one. I think we would need another one and a more serious one before, the human race begins to actually change its ways. So I suppose it depends. Yeah, if we're out of this pandemic and we're all out and about in a few months, of course. But if we get ourselves into an even more deadlier pandemic and start to trap ourselves even more into, which is conceivable, right? Then then maybe we end up in a different kind of a realm. Okay, that's sci-fi.
You oscillate so quickly between
yeah, that
cynicism
was.
and idealism.
What?
You are like a pendulum of cynical and idealist.
I mean, I think that you can take a longer view, and these are real concerns. I don't know that like they should keep us up at night, but they're not ridiculous.
They're
not,
there. Yeah, that makes sense.
right. The other thing though, before I jump back into the slides, I thought you meant I oscillate because I'm off on this tangent about virtual realities that we all live in.
No, just your point of view towards the world. You'll be cynical and idealist back and forth.
Sure, but I mean, I guess because I was a journalist for so long, right? We do these because I'm so interested in being non-biased. I guess that's anyway. But the issue I was going to raise was you brought up Stephen Glass, and the thing that I got watching that with you all this semester the most. Tell me if you guys can relate. Is the way that he knew how to game the system. The idea of backstopping that he did, where he had been a fact checker, and so he knew how to at least create with a minimum of effort the things that if the back checkers were being lazy or they were being careless, that they wouldn't catch, right? And like what I'm really interested in about Noe's examples is, are we going to find that the QAnon people are doing what Stephen Glass did? That they're backstopping a little bit. And so we might say, I might teach you guys I'm vain, and I might throw up a slide here and I might say video, audio, photos. There you go. There's evidence. Now we'll talk about indirect evidence. We're done. That's opening a freezer, right? And the QAnon people are aware of this stuff too. I mean, maybe not this PowerPoint, but they're aware of these issues, and they're backstopping, or they're getting into a deeper level of faking things. Now, am I being the conspiracy theorist, or do you think that this is a real? I mean, maybe we'll see, right? When Noe brings up her stuff, but I'm beginning to think that the disinformation gets more and more sophisticated as that we're always 2 steps behind in trying to teach the news literacy as the disinformation that's coming out. And one of the ways that I think that we could also test that is, has anybody looked at the New York Post reporting on Hunter Biden? Because I think that would be an interesting example of like, okay, in addition to QAnon, okay, let me not draw some a priori judgment about the truth or untruthfulness of the New York Post reporting. I mean, I can tell you none of the other news organizations, including ones in the Rupert Murdoch empire, would touch the story. But, if you look at it, how sophisticated is it? How easy is it to debunk? How convincing is it? How true is it? You know, is it totally true? And are we the ones who don't want to believe it? Maybe because we're all in for Biden and anti-Trump, and so we're biased and we're not seeing the exposure of corruption that the New York Post brought to light, right? It already seems to have faded from the headlines, but this was the Hillary Clinton email hack, or not Hillary Clinton. This was the DNC email hack of 2020. That just happened a week ago or so, where the New York Post came through with all these revelations about Joe Biden's son, and it was a controversy for a while. Twitter wouldn't put it up, Facebook wouldn't put it up, so then that raises a controversy of, are these social media organizations now going too far the other direction, where they're overreacting and being too full, you know, too bad about, are they being censors now? So it's worth looking at, right? All right, so we've looked at direct evidence.
After a series of scandals.
Here's another example of it, okay?
After a series of scandals, Facebook is under fire again over newly released documents that show an apparent pattern of exploiting minors for their parents' money. More than 100 pages of documents, it's all part of a 2012 lawsuit, were released last night. They show Facebook was aware children spent large sums of money on game apps without parental consent. The suit alleges the social media giant made it difficult for parents then to get their money back. Carter Evans spoke with the mother behind the lawsuit.
What was it like when you opened that bill?
It was very shocking to see.
Glynis Bohannon let her 12-year-old son use her credit card to play the game Ninja Saga on Facebook. But that initial charge of $19.95
Okay, so I think you guys get the idea, right?
cents a month.
That's an example of documents, right, that are used. And now it's not letting me.
How much was her bill?
I don't know. Through the whole. That's a great question.
Because I want to know.
You sure you don't want to be a journalist? Because that is a beautiful question. Yeah. That's funny, because I was already losing interest in that story just when you were gaining interest, right? So, why, do you have any anecdotal like experience with that type of thing, or you just, what would you
Yeah,
get?
on my bingo.
Well, what do you
when I
mean?
play bingo on my phone,
Uh-huh.
and like you, sorry, I was talking too loud. You can like I could play bingo on my phone, and it like it charges my card, and sometimes it charges my card like 3 or 4 times, even though I haven't played. So I was just wondering. I'm like, is they doing the same thing?
Yeah, hundreds of dollars, maybe?
No, not hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
enough to hurt, right?
yeah.
Okay. All right. So so that's documentation, and obviously documentation is, you know, really an important thing for you guys to learn. Have you guys done, any of you guys done yet the online journalism activities that I gave you for the week? You had a choice of doing the one for iBBC Reporter or BBC iReporter, or the other one was practicing quality journalism through Checkology. Have you, any of you guys tried one of those yet? So, I mean, I think the BBC iReporter one might be more entertaining. I suppose both of them deal with documents in a certain way. But, you know, I think the Checkology, practicing quality journalism, might be less like entertaining in a way, but it's really worthwhile in terms of the way that you overlay, you know, eyewitness testimony with documents to get, you know, and maybe with your own view of the scene, or your own personal testimony, you know, your own observation as a journalist, in order to gather the evidence and know that what you're reporting is real. So the documents that reporters use is really important, and as you guys gain experience in journalism, those of you that are going into the major, one of the big things you're going to need to learn is how to navigate the bureaucracies and how to obtain the appropriate kind of documents, right? And they can also be a really great source for story ideas. So, okay. You know, so then this is an example of when I was just mentioning eyewitness, you know, accounts and how important those are. What they're saying is that they interviewed these National Guardsmen, and as turned out, they turned out to be very valuable sources for the stories, because these guardsmen were able to, you know, they spoke their minds, or they gave their own points of view, and they said National Guardsmen, many guardsmen said they felt uncomfortable with the way they were used to handle the unrest because demonstrators lumped them in with the police. They felt that while they swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, their presence at times intimidated Americans from expressing their opinions and even escalated tension. So this is a great example of, you know, the sources in a story being eyewitness to things themselves. And then we get into indirect evidence. Okay, so that would include accounts from representatives, like if somebody has their lawyer speak to the press. You know, secondhand accounts as well. I heard somebody else say this, right? Which, you know, and the notes here say sometimes there is no silver bullet that unequivocally proves or disproves something. In those cases, journalists have to rely on what's known as indirect evidence, which is one step removed or arm's length evidence. It often comes from secondhand sources, secondhand witnesses or experts. So Noah, you obviously know a little bit about court cases. Do you know what they call this kind of indirect evidence in court?
Circumstantial?
No, it's hearsay.
Oh, okay, I see. Secondhand. Yep, that makes sense. Yep.
Right. And which means that I heard somebody else say it, or somebody told me this. So you're getting it secondhand, right?
That's a whole objection in court. You cannot testify and say that.
Yeah, the hearsay is inadmissible. That's right. And so then these are other examples, computer modeling. So I can have all these great computer models that show Joe Biden wins the election, but is it going to actually happen? Or inferences from evidence. So there may be evidence, but what I conclude from that is open for debate, right? And so here's an example of inference from evidence. Okay, so Oreos are addictive to your brain. Okay, so maybe let's take a look at the link that they provide here about that. Hold on. My cat is in the way of my, oh wait, did they just pop it out? Hold on. A small new study suggests the brain responds to Oreo cookies quite like it responds to actual drugs, at least if you're a rat, right? So I can pull it up, but I mean, you can imagine where this is going, right? They found that rats do certain things because of Oreo cookies, and that they do it maybe compared to morphine. So then they're saying, new study suggests the brain responds to Oreo cookies quite like it responds to actual drugs, at least if you're a rat. The pleasure center of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, apparently get just as activated in response to Oreos as they do to cocaine or morphine, which could actually have some major public health implications. While the study was done in rats, the authors say it's likely relevant to humans as well, and would explain why people have such a hard time resisting an entire sleeve of the cookies. So do you guys buy it? Oreo cookies are just like cocaine or morphine?
That is a massive logical leap.
Yeah, right.
The author really said, you know what, I know this much about, you know, science. I can confidently say that if it happens to rats, is there an actual part where they say it likely applies to humans as it does to rats? Because that would be just.
Well, it is about navigating a maze, and we all have our own little personal mazes. No, so, you know, the team trained rats to navigate a maze, which we can all relate to that experience. Right? So I don't know. Yeah, good point. How much does this really apply to human beings? And, you know, did they try I guess they must have given the cats cocaine and morphine too, you know, to compare, but you know, who knows? All right, so let's move on to I'm Vain. You guys ready for this one? So, okay. Oh, there's a lot of slides here. Okay, so first of all, what are we getting out of this lecture? We're appreciating the values of sources' contributions to reports. We're applying the concepts of I'm Vain. So first I'm going to introduce you to the concepts of I'm Vain, but then we'll talk about how you actually use them to evaluate the reliability of news sources, understand appropriate uses and abuses of anonymous sources, which is important. So to begin with, so I don't know if we'll get all the way to anonymous sources. I hope so, but it looks like there's a fair amount to cover. These are outlets, okay? So do you guys remember when we talked about this and distinguishing between the two? Does anyone want to explain what's the difference between outlets and sources? Anyone say? These are outlets, what are sources? Let's create this distinction. Luna, you got an idea? I lost you. Luna, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Any idea? What's the difference between outlets and sources?
I think outlets are kind of like the people that kind of like are giving the sources, like they're telling about them.
You mean the reporters? Close.
Yeah, the reporters.
Yeah, close. Megumi, Meg, do you know? Do you have an idea? Well, okay, I'll just go ahead and explain it. So the outlets are, these are examples, they're showing them right there. And then the sources are these people, the people in the stories. So the outlets, you're kind of close, Luna, but I mean, these are the outlets, right? The publications, the news organizations. And then these are the sources. Now that's important because if you think about how a lot of times, like from the beginning of the course, we were talking about this stuff where I would say, well, how do you distinguish what's true and what's not true? And do you guys remember how people answered at the beginning of the course? Remember I asked, like first day, I asked Libby, Libby answered. I said, how do you know what's true and what's not true? Does anyone remember how she answered?
Credible sources?
Okay, credible sources or credible outlets? You know, if I said to you guys, how many of you guys would agree or disagree with it? If I said, how do you tell what's true and not true? And you'd say, well, if I saw it on like in the Associated Press or, you know, the New York Times, I would maybe believe it. But if I see it on Fox News or, you know, Breitbart or something like that, I'd be more skeptical. Does that seem like a good way to distinguish what's true and what's not true? What's reliable news and what's not? Have I stumped you guys? How many of you do that?
Is this supposed to be about bias, or is this like completely different? Because I feel like we're going back to bias.
Well, maybe you are. I mean, I'm just saying, is it true or not true? Like, is judging by, like, is the fact that Fox did the report, does that mean that it's maybe not true? Like, in other words, is one way to determine whether something is true or not true is to look at, you know, who put it out? Is it from ABC? Is it, you know, from one of these? All these look like, I don't know, maybe we consider these reliable. Maybe the Huffington Post is less reliable. is that a good way to evaluate whether something is true or not? Like if it's Fox, I'm going to be more skeptical and like, you know.
I mean, I'd say it's a good place to start. Credibility exists as a tool for journalists to kind of weed out usually what is reliable and what's not, or at least a tool for the public to kind of make decisions. It can lead to bias, I'd say, but generally a lot of the outlets I see here are like a good place to start, as in terms of having credibility or not.
So like if I'm a conservative and you are arguing with me and you say, here's a story in the New York Times about Trump and his taxes. And I say, that's just the New York Times. This is a bunch of libtards. Have I done a good test of what's true and what's not true? Because you know what I mean? You see the problem with judging by trying to use the outlet as a measuring rod for the reliability of something?
Well, that also gives you like variety in terms of sources, because if it's a big enough story, you can have multiple people that reported on it and kind of cross-check that, I'd say. Not to kind of further that argument, but that's another function that having multiple outlets serves.
Right. Okay. So that's a different method of determining the truth then. Now you're saying, I'm going to call that lateral reading, which we're not going to have time to get to this week because we're already dealing with opening the freezer and I'm vain, right? But that would be the next thing. You know, if we're going to look at QAnon stuff, if Noe's going to share some of that, I might say we're going to deal with, you know, I'm vain in that method, but we'll also use lateral reading, right? Which is, by which I mean what Noah's talking about, which is reading many different sources right across the internet. But what they're saying is, be careful about, you know, relying on outlets versus sources, right? You know, an outlet is a purveyor of news. A source is a person who's, you know, used or interviewed in a news report, right? Like this guy. We have to rethink how we address infection control, the CDC director. So Officer Kenneth Healy and 3 on-duty colleagues were posing for a picture when a hatchet-wielding man charged them unprovoked, according to Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. Okay, now that's a secondhand source, right? But, you know, a student locked down inside a classroom told CNN by phone that the shooting began in the cafeteria. Now that's a very direct source, right? So there's different sources. So now this is, when we talk about relying on an outlet and about relying on sources, does everybody know the case of Iraq and WMD, the weapons of mass destruction? You guys familiar with this whole story? So, you know, what happened was there was all of the suspicion that in the months leading up to the Iraq war, that Saddam Hussein was building this arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, chemical warheads, biological weapons. And the reporter for the New York Times, who was like the lead reporter and was on the story breaking all the front page news, was a woman named Judith Miller. And she published all these stories talking about, you know, how they had amassed this terrible arsenal like Iraq, and how there was this imminent threat. And it all appeared on the front page of the New York Times. And then what turned out happening was, you know, and then you had Colin Powell, who came to the UN and said, oh, look, we have these photographs of, you know, weapons of mass destruction and all this evidence. And next thing you know, we're at war. Well, you know, it turned out that the person feeding Judith Miller all the information about Iraq's supposed weapons of mass destruction, she used the code name for him, Curveball. So she did not name the source. He was an anonymous source in her stories. And it turned out that he was full of BS. He was against Saddam Hussein, and he wanted you know, he wanted the United States to take him out. And the people in the White House, Dick Cheney mainly, and his group of people who worked for him, kept feeding Curveball and all these other sources to Judith Miller, and she printed the stuff. And you could argue that one of the problems was that she got maybe a little too close to power, a little seduced by having such top level access to information. But it, you know, two things I guess come to light about that is that, you know, maybe sometimes we can't always rely on the source, because here's the New York Times that really screwed this up. And the other was when it's an anonymous source, you know, sometimes we really have to question the quality of the information. And now she's had to sort of step down and do this, you know, mea culpa, where she admitted it was wrong. Okay. So this is kind of why sources matter. And then we get into the thing of critical thinking, how important it is. I mean, I think you guys are bringing this up. It's like, well, how do we know that we're not just going to believe anything about what we see and hear? And, you know, that's a matter of critical thinking, right? And so along those lines, this is where we get into the I'm vain checklist. And the idea is that, you know, you get a piece of news, and there's this acronym, like for how we identify the sourcing and how you identify the sourcing, which is I'm vain: independent, multiple, verifiable, authoritative, informed, named, and named. Okay. And so in the workbook, you're going to find like this checklist that you can use for each of these. And you kind of can say, yeah, I kind of agree. No, I don't agree. And then you offer a bit of an explanation of your logic for why you come to that conclusion. And then at the end, you look at how you did in going through the checklist and come to a conclusion. Now, my big question for you, Noe, is how well would this work with the QAnon people?
Okay, so while I was looking at my sources, a majority of them only had like 2 out of the 5. So all of them were pretty much not reliable sources, which I wasn't that surprised about. But
well, but they don't say here that they have to have all of that, right? But maybe you do have to wonder how well does you know, when you have this checklist, how well does it hold up? Does that make sense?
Yeah, like we should be skeptical if they're not like at least hitting more than 2 or 1. I don't know.
I mean, I think you have to practice it for a while, but I think the main idea is that if you take this checklist and you start going through it with a given piece of news, maybe it starts to make you realize what some of the real problems are. Because I think what happens is that people don't go through this thought process. That's the premise of teaching I'm vain. Do you guys buy that? That a lot of people we know, maybe a lot of friends, just a lot of people in our society, don't pay careful enough attention to the sourcing? What do you guys think?
I can believe that 25% of Americans are believing QAnon because it's believable, but it's still not like there's no credible source attached to like what they're saying. So I don't really understand how so many people are just kind of accepting the facts.
Maybe we'll get more insight when we try and take I'm vain and lateral reading and try and apply it to QAnon, right? So, okay, they do run through, you guys want to do one of these quick I'm vain exercises and then call it a day?
Yeah.
All right, so this is one about this Success Academy where, you know, this student, this teacher was, you know, caught out for the way she treated the students.
You cut or you split. So count it again, making sure you're counting correctly. lounge chair and sit. There's nothing that infuriates me more than when you don't do what's on your paper. Somebody come up and show me how she should have counted to get her answer that was 1 in a split. Show my friends and teach them. Thank you. Do not go back to your seat and show me one thing and then don't do it here. You're confusing everybody.
Okay, so that's the clip. So now it's kind of like our Zoom classes, isn't it? So sort of like how I am in Zoom with you guys. All three of you, or 2 of you. Is Meg there? Meg, are you there? I think Meg passed out. Anyways, so let's ask ourselves these questions. So Noe, to your point, how do you use this checklist? Does this source have anything to gain by withholding information or making misleading students? So it looks like it's an assistant a teacher who's doing that, right? So, would you say this source, do we know much about the source? I guess we'd have to look at the story a little bit more, right? To find out. Let me grab the link. So what do we find out about this source? In the video, first grade, the teacher works at Success Academy in Brooklyn. She's been considered so effective that the network promoted her last year to being a model teacher. After sending the girl out of the circle and having another child demonstrate how to, so she's explaining that. The video was recorded surreptitiously in the fall by an assistant teacher who was concerned by what she described as Ms. Dial's daily harsh treatment of the children. The assistant teacher, who insisted on anonymity because she feared endangering future job prospects, shared the video with the New York Times after she left Success in November. After being shown the video last month, Ann Powell's Success spokesman described its contents as shocking and said Ms. Dial had been suspended, right? And it goes on from there. So would you guys say that the source is independent? Does this source have anything to gain by withholding information or making misleading comments? If there's a conflict, the most reliable sources have no stake in the outcome. Independent experts, for example, are less likely to mislead than partisans. What do you guys think? Independent?
I mean,
think so.
I'd say so. It just said it was an assistant teacher. They didn't have anything to gain from applying it.
Right. Intellectually independent, politically neutral, financial interests at stake, family or friends. So these are the kind of things that we think about, And then what about this? Is this independent? Ivo Moskowitz, leader of the Success Academy Network, is she independent? Ms. Moskowitz dismissed the video as an anomaly. A group of parents gathered by the Cobble Hill School's principal defended Ms. Dial and said the video did not reflect their experience of the school. Ms. Moskowitz said in an interview and a subsequent email that Ms. Dial's behavior did not match Success's educational philosophy, but she also called her a wonderful and committed teacher and said she lost her cool because she so desperately wants her kids to succeed and fulfill their potential. So tough question. No. Is Ms. Moskowitz independent? No.
I'd say she has more to gain by, she's covering her ass a little bit. So she's explaining how the teaching style is an anomaly, which sets her reputation apart. But she's also kind of covering for Dial and being like, normally she's not like this. So she does have more to gain than the assistant teacher, I'd say.
Yeah, well, it says here in the notes, the reputation of the school she's in charge of is at stake, right? Her leadership is under question. So she's tied into this very directly too, Joseph McDonald, a professor of teaching and learning at New York's University School of Education, who viewed the video of the New York Times' request, described Ms. Dial's behavior as abusive teaching. We don't see enough here to know for sure that this classroom is typically full of fear, but I bet that it is, he wrote in an email. The fear is likely not only about whether my teacher may at any time erupt with anger and punish me dramatically, but also whether I can ever be safe making mistakes. Independent?
Yeah, he's already a professor. He's doesn't need the job, so yeah, it's independent.
He doesn't work at Success Academy, right? He's not connected to them. All right, are there multiple sources? What we call corroboration of what we learned. Did you guys notice any?
Of the first story about that abusive teacher?
Yeah.
Well, it's raw footage. It's not, you mean like by, well, I guess Moskowitz didn't, she confirmed that the footage was real, but she didn't shed, like, didn't paint it well. She
Right.
did confirm that it happened though.
So, she did. And so, this next slide illustrates it. So we could go back over the text of the article itself, but this sums it up, right? There's all of this corroboration. There's video, there's Success Academy's training materials, there's interviews with 20 current and former Success teachers that suggest that while Ms. Dial's behavior might be extreme, it's not uncommon within the network. And there's that interview with the NYU professor, right? Now, verification. What does verification mean, and how is it different than corroboration? Here we're checking to see if the source is providing facts or just opinion. Is there evidence to support the source's claim, or is it at least possible to verify the claims? Okay, so that would be, we lost Noah. So, are the claims verified or verifiable? The former teachers describe what they witness, and there's Joseph McDonald again. So it's not clear to me how they're necessarily distinguishing corroboration from verification there, but I might say, say that the video is verification. The other things are, you could call them verification, but maybe a better word just to make a distinction would be corroboration. Like the Joseph McDonald, the NYU professor. Did the source open the freezer? One way to think about this is, shouldn't the reporter ask a source if he or she opened the freezer? And do we have any sense of that? Authoritative and informed. So I think in terms of opening the freezer, shouldn't the reporter always ask if he or she opened the freezer? Isn't that what we mean by opening the freezer? We have video, right? And evidently obviously the reporter would have looked at it before going any further with the story and talking to the assistant teacher, meeting the assistant teacher, him or herself, right? Mm-hmm. And then authoritative and informed. Here are some questions asked when you're evaluating an anonymous source. Is there an adequate explanation why the source must remain anonymous? Is there sufficient information to establish the source's value? It's a witness, a coworker. So they may be informed without necessarily being authoritative, right? That guy from NYU might be authoritative, but being informed might be like, refer to the assistant teacher who was actually in the classroom. And then, so the questions would be, is Eva Moskowitz, is she authoritative and is she informed? How about Ann Powell? How about the former teacher, right? So, and then finally, are the people named? And so, did they go on the record with their name, right?
So informed means that they were a part of the situation, right?
Well, with this acronym, it's not entirely clear, but I like to emphasize, since we already have authoritative as a letter,
Mm-hmm.
I like to emphasize maybe by informed, we mean somebody who had direct experience with it.
Okay. Because I was really like struggling with the I and A because they kind of seem similar, but authority is like they have like a title that would.
They have expertise,
Okay.
like that guy from NYU is professor of education. He's trained in issues of education. So he's authoritative. Now, is he informed? Well, he watched the video, but is he informed in the way the assistant teacher is? I would say no. So, and then the transparency is this issue of, do we get an adequate explanation of why the source is remaining anonymous? We got through corroboration. So, there went Meg. So, all right. So that's, why don't we leave it there, Noe? But
Okay.
you think you could use that for, what's it called? For,
QAnon.
QAnon?
I could send you the slides right now, but it's sort of like just bare bones. Like I had the examples and then I am vain next to it and I did a little checklist, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, now that understand it a little bit, do you understand a little bit better now?
I think so. I think I could go back and like check a few things, but majority of it, I'm pretty sure they're just all, the only things they had checked off was probably independence and verification. The rest, I kind of just assumed that it wasn't like, yeah.
Right.
Mm.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe go over it now that you understand it better. Our attendance on these, I'm a little concerned about, what do you think? Has your attendance kept up in your other async classes or what?
I can't really tell because my math class is like a 90-person class, but half the time it's like people are coming in